Welcome, my friends, to the Happy by Mistake pod, building an abundant mindset for life and business. If you're a small business owner, entrepreneur, practitioner, or perhaps an executive feeling tapped out in their career, then you've come to the right place. In this pod, I tackle common challenges and themes that come up in the coaching that I do. And for the most part, I do that by having free flowing dialogue with an expert on the topic. All right, let's dive into the latest episode. Today, I have the great pleasure of welcoming a close friend and a colleague, Rene Garcia, to the podcast, where we're going to explore what First Nations communities can perhaps teach us about thriving in what I think many people consider an increasingly complex and maybe even disjointed world. I'm so excited to welcome Rene and so excited to explore this fascinating topic. But before we get started, let me tell you a little bit about the work that Rene does. So, Rene is an organizational consultant with over 20 years, I think, of experience. He's worked in profit and nonprofit organizations in a number of different countries and a number of different cultures in Latin America and in Canada. His working experience involves projects in different fields like health, education, manufacturing, mining, banking, occupational health and safety, the full gamut. Now, since 2019, he's worked extensively with First Nations organizations across Canada, supporting in the development of improved organizational effectiveness and capacity building. He holds a bachelor in psychology, a graduate diploma in human resources management from McGill, a coaching certification, and a master's degree in human systems intervention from Concordia University. I also want to introduce this conversation with a very important caveat up front, and that is the obvious. We are two men from outside the culture trying to learn from a different culture, to find new perspectives. We come as visitors to a culture that we believe can lend us some of their wisdom, some different perspectives perhaps to widen our own. Rene comes as a welcome guest who works closely with the community. I'm a complete outsider. We are both very aware of this as we embark on this, I think, what will be a very interesting discussion. I'll be asking Rene questions about a culture to which he is a visitor and asking him to reflect on his experience in relation to what we can learn about their culture and what wisdom we might borrow to help us thrive in ours. We are both, Rene especially, very aware that whatever he offers is through the lens of his culture, an outsider trying to glean wisdom through a somewhat distorted lens. But I can assure you we bring open eyes, more importantly, open hearts, and a burning curiosity to learn in any small way that we can. And we come into it hoping to learn and grow. Welcome, Rene.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Corey. Very happy to be with you here today.
It's good to see you.
Yeah.
So, you've been working with First Nations communities in northern Quebec mostly, and other areas of Canada for about 5 years now. Thinking back to the person who walked into that world back in 2019, what is different about the person you are now?
Yeah. And I think I will start even before that, because the way you framed this conversation and when you were introducing myself and all those years of experience, I was feeling, wow, I'm old. but but the real thing is that I have been always very curious and open to learn and to learn from others. And before I start working with First Nations organizations, I knew about. I did my thesis in psychology in Chile with the Mapuche people, especially about the poetry of female and the symbolism in poetry at the time. So I was always curious, but I didn't have a working experience as a consultant. And I would say that before I was very much into getting things done, into achieving results, or trying to get to a point of, oh, I'm impacting this organization or this community in a way that, yeah, I can see the benefit. And now I feel like I have learned a lot, but I have learned a lot about myself too, and how to be more patient and have more awareness of the process more than the outcomes. I'm still result oriented, of course, but how we get there, how I connect with the people, what I'm learning in the process, that is substantially different from 6 years ago.
So, what would you say to that person in 2019 walking into that world? What advice would you give them?
Well, for sure, it's like keep that genuine curiosity and openness, and try to see always the positive, be appreciative. But also, you will have to manage frustration and be patient, and probably engage with complexity in a different way. And I mean, Corey, we studied together. Complexity was always fascinating for me, but it's a different thing to be navigating the complexity, knowing that you don't know all the variables, that there's so much behind, or from other aspects happening at the same time, and it's part of the game. So navigate that complexity.
Okay. So, this podcast is really about thriving in abundance. And I guess I'm going to give you a question that may be hard to answer, and feel free to pass. If there's one thing you've taken from First Nations people about the idea of thriving, what would it be?
Well, again, I think it's important to put in context what is the reality of First Nations in Canada, what has happened in the last, I would say, since I have been working with them in the last 6 years, but in the last 100 years, many things happened. So it's difficult to don't put over the table like the challenges of that painful past, and all what happened with residential schools and colonization. So knowing that, and of course each community is different First Nations, different realities, the capacity to be resilient and to try to overcome challenges, and connect with their essence, and that willingness to bring the best for their people, their community, knowing that they feel, not everybody of course, but that there's a need for balance situation, is very strong. It's very strong, and it's not like a super strong force. It's more like there's a drive for maybe a long-term growth that is there, and I appreciate that for sure.
So when you say not like this, almost, I think you were describing it, it's not like this frenetic energy, it's more of this long-term drive.
Yes.
So does that speak to a different sort of perspective around time or around change?
Well, you're bringing something very interesting, the notion of time. Again, as I said before, there's something about the process and being patient that I learned. I come from a different culture. I was more focused in getting things done, and hopefully in a timeline, and with during this year calendar, things like that.
Yeah.
And I have learned a lot about is not just about getting things done. It's about how we get things done, and that needs to be meaningful, and including hopefully everyone's perspective. So the notion of time, and and I'm going to use some words that the elders use when they really try to connect with everyone in the communities or in the organizations. Like, it's not for us, it's for the people that was before us, and it's for the people who will come after us. So that immediately changed the notion of time. There's a sense of transcendence, continuity, and of course, individuals that are in leadership positions or making decisions, they play a key role, but it's not for them. It's for who was before and who will come after, for the next generations. So that changed a lot the way you see, in my context, organizational change, big projects, because it takes a different time.
So you go into it as this sort of driven, results-oriented person who is used to an organizational change environment that is very driven by milestones, specific dates, specific achievements, and you walk into a world that is thinking about time differently and with an intention that is not so much about what do we do now to benefit us, but what we do to benefit those that have come before and those that have come, those that are yet to come. That's a very different expectation environment, I think.
Yeah, and at the same time, or in the same process, I need to bring the sense of urgency of some elements. If we're not capable to identify this or to generate that, probably we will not get there. And when it gets more complex, is that these organizations, these communities, they get funds, right? They have some budget, some resources, but the challenge is how to manage those funds in an effective way. So that's in some way where it comes for more technical expertise to support in organize and make those progress. But the other thing, and probably this is one of the key learnings, I have learned a lot of how to adapt and be flexible, because it's not just about time, it's also about priorities. And what it could seem for me a priority because of my Western perspective, maybe it's not a priority for them. And that's the dance. Like, sometimes priorities change. Now I fully understand. First was like, why this is changing? But now I see that there are many implications that because of the complexities in the communities, being isolated up north, or because of the reality they have faced, I can give you examples, like with the fires last year and the evacuations of the community members. Of course, everything is paused, or there are different priorities. But those changes involves a lot of adaptability from my side, and being flexible also to, okay, we will come back, we will move this meeting, or let's start with this now, and we will postpone that.
So this seems to connect to me to this idea of time, but there's also something else in there, because you're sort of alluding to, is it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it almost seems like in these organizations, it's less driven by, say, an individual, and there is more a sense of, as you already alluded to, the past and the future, but the community as a whole. Is that right? Am I judging that right, or is that a misconception?
No, that's a good observation. Of course, I work with organizations that they serve the community, right? Will be because of the education, the health, or the governance system. Yeah. So ultimately, it's about the community. Then, of course, as any organization, you need a structure. and there needs to be leadership positions, making decisions, working together, collaboration, communication, all those elements. Uh, but I would say that a big difference is that there's a different need for finding consensus, and taking the time to really involve everyone's
Mm.
perspective. Uh, that is different, in my perspective, from what other organizations in the Western society are expecting from leaders. And you need to be accountable. You need to make the decision. So that there's a tension there is happening. I will add that also because these communities are growing and they
Mm.
have different needs. Community members have more needs, in terms of housing, public works, different elements, programs to support the growth of the community members. So this is more complex.
Mm. Mm.
And that's new for these organizations, these leaders too.
So you're talking about a tension between, um, a way of being that really takes the time to focus on the collective and get feedback from different sources within the collective, and this other side of needing to take on roles of responsibility and accountability individually. Is that what you're?
Yeah, in some
Yeah,
way,
yeah.
like my way of seeing is that historically in the past, communities were smaller. Well, bands, right? We really go back. They were nomads, moving, much more freedom. When they were forced to settle and be, like a community and generate all these projects around, then they need to be more careful in how they make decisions. In the past, it was easier to have reflections and then ask the chief or who was in leadership to make a final decision with all these elements. Now it's going much faster.
Mm.
And people that are directors of department, they need to be capable to make faster decisions. So that's an evolution. That's a challenge they are facing. One of the many challenges in these communities, and yeah, it's very interesting.
So many of the First Nations communities in Canada are at far lower income levels than the rest of Canada. Add into that, generational trauma. Add into that there are numerous different sort of federal sort of treaties and charters
Yes.
and laws that govern what they do. Sometimes the bureaucracy, from what I've heard, can be really, really difficult within say, a reservation system, somebody wanting to open a new business,
Hmm.
a lot of hoops to jump through, and frustration there. So if there is a community within Canada that knows something about challenge, that knows something about resilience, it's these communities. Um, so I guess where and this is a big question, you may not be able to answer this, but ultimately, because we're talking about thriving, because we're talking about abundance, I just am curious if there, from your observations, from your experience, are there any factors, any commonalities that explain why some uh, communities, maybe some people within communities, thrive more than others
Mm.
within the First Nations people that you've worked with?
Yeah, and because you mentioned across Canada, yeah, just to give you also what I'm learning. Like recently this year, I was in Winnipeg to a big conference, and there was representatives from different First Nations communities all around Canada, and I was impressed of the diversity. Mm? Like in Canada there are over 600 First Nations, and the reality is very
I,
diverse.
I actually didn't know there was over 600. If you had asked me, I would have guessed it was probably like under 100. That's amazing.
Yeah,
Keep,
it's
sorry
huge.
to interrupt you. Keep going.
No worries. So I'm learning about this. Like I thought that was over 300, but now I see it's over 600 acknowledged, recognized First Nations communities or bands. And the reality of these communities is very different depending on how far they are isolated, the different treaties they have. Many of them are still under the Indian Act, while others, like in Quebec, they have the James Bay Agreement, so they have access to different funds. Some of them are very close to big cities. The reserve is just beside and they can go to Walmart or to buy Starbucks coffee, while others are really far and they don't
Right.
have access to suppliers, and it's very high, the cost of living. So in that complexity, um, I would say the communities that are capable to thrive are the ones that have alignment in leadership, in what they want. And that could take time because there's also the complexity that they have like a chief and council, elected members from the community to become the councillors. So that's more like a political body. And then you have the administration for the different departments position, like a city hall.
Right.
And sometimes there is tension, friction between those two bodies, like in any society. But these are small communities. So when you have leadership that is capable to have open conversations and align what we really want, what are the two, three things that we really need to put on top of our priorities to support our community members and generate that cohesion, that's where I see that thriving is more fluid, is possible. It will take time because when you have that, there's, I would say, like a natural way to, okay, we need this kind of support, or we don't need to focus on that. This is what we care now. And that makes things more fluid.
Okay. So, in the development of that shared vision of where they want to go, getting back to time, getting back to community, is it a longer process because of those, because of how built into their way of being it is to hear from everybody? Is it a long process to get to that vision in your experience, or let me know?
Yeah, well, time is relative. Like honestly, when I go to some of these communities, imagine that there's no street lights, there's no traffic there, and sometimes I'm expecting to have like two meetings, and well, one meeting that was for 1 hour takes 3 hours, and a meeting that was supposed to be for an hour is just 15 minutes. So the notion of time is very relative, but I think if we compare with other organizations, yes, takes longer. Uh, but I will add, it's because people don't want to make mistakes too. There's a fear to fail, to their community, and probably there's again some connection with trauma about that, and the challenge of if I'm making a decision, it will be the good decision. I prefer to go back to the collective to feel maybe more supported or safe. Um, it's a different approach.
I could make the argument that that's a sign of wisdom. I mean, in Western organizations that I've worked with, my biggest challenge was getting them to slow down, and be strategic and really connect with the people in the organization, and take the time to really parse that out, right? So, not denying that there's fear there in a changing landscape for them, but maybe there's also a sense of wisdom. Like, we're not there yet. Maybe I need to connect, more. Maybe I need to delve deeper into the communal wisdom. Just a thought.
Uh, uh, well, I think there's something of that for sure. It's part of how they were reflecting and making decisions in the past. That's from where they come. And again, I'm not an expert. I'm learning in this
Yeah.
process. But it makes me think, of course, in leaders that they want to have the best of both worlds, let's say. How we can be more agile in some definitions, because of course there's, I don't know, you have a fund, you need to use that fund in a certain period of time, but also you want to be sure that this is the best for the whole. And I think in previous conversations we talk about how science can be supporting or not, and I was reflecting on the work of it's Peter Senge and Melanie Goodchild, and they were like questioning system thinking or how to decolonize system thinking, where I think the goal here is to build bridges from how we think systems and the way we interact, and how indigenous, and I don't mean just North American indigenous organizations, they think or they decide, is how we can generate gentle bridges to have the best from both, and learn from each other.
Gentle bridges between sort of older ways of organizing and newer ways of organizing because of the changes that are in front of them. Is that what you're referring to?
Not only the ways of organizing, is the way how we approach situations or a project. I'm thinking that it's important to understand your worldviews, to know from where you come. Once I did an exercise, and I can give you an example. This is coming from the Human System Dynamics Institute. One tool they have is like, it's called decision map. It's like a triangle with three different elements. Like, well, I adapted to my project, and it was like on top, like what are the beliefs, the paradigms, the worldviews that guide your kind of your values, that guides your decisions.
Right.
Then another angle is like, what are the norms, the rules, the policies, like the thing that you have established for your community, your organization, that we're going to do this, this is what is expected, these are the 2-3 key norms that we need to follow.
Yeah.
And then reality. What is happening at the end? Are we following our values, beliefs, or are we following the norms? Is there alignment between these or two? So to explain that, like, there was some misconnection between the worldview and then the norms. So in reality, nothing was happening, or there was this friction.
Right.
And I think that's the kind of reflection that needs to happen. Like, if we have going back to your question about time, if we have this belief about Indian time, which is kind of expanded, or it's not because of at 10 p.m. or 10, no, it's more like when the suns come up and then when we have the sunset.
Right.
But then we expect that people need to be at the office at 9 o'clock, and the lunch break is just 1 hour.
Yeah.
If this is intention, what will happen in reality is that people would not respect the norms, or people will just follow the old worldview about time, but there will be this lack of consistency. What
And I can. Sorry. Go ahead. No.
So what I
Continue.
think is relevant here is to bring awareness to these tensions.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess. Like, certainly, I can understand in a community going through change, setting up a norm, like in to the office at 9, out of the office at 5, and that if only half the people are doing that, that's going to cause problems. But you're also talking to a guy that thinks 9 to 5 is the outdated sort of carryover of the Industrial Revolution,
Right.
right? And that maybe their way of thinking about time is a little better aligned to sort of the knowledge work that a lot of us do these days. But that's a whole other topic. I'll bring you back on to discuss that one because that's one I feel pretty strongly about.
But just to add to that complexity, think about the challenge of intergenerational
Right.
at the workplace, where you have like some of the baby boomers or Gen X that they are, by the book and they follow, and then you have all these new generations, people in their 20s, that they want to work remotely,
Yeah.
or
Yeah. Yeah. Which
that's
just
happening
adds
there
another
too.
adds another layer.
Yeah, and it's
One
happening
of
there
the
too.
one of the areas that I'm curious about is this idea of what we in Western cultures typically refer to as conflict resolution, specifically in a in a workplace environment. Um, the reason I'm interested in that is I had done a little bit of work with a First Nations community in the Kingston area associated with the university. I got to opportunity to sit in on some of their trainings
Mm,
uh, sat through a blanket ceremony and things like that. Very, very moving and emotional. And one of the elders took some time to explain to me that, at least in their community, they didn't think of conflict resolution the way that I thought of conflict resolution. To them, it was more about sort of the concept of the longhouse, and
mhm,
that everybody was part of that. And if there was if there was a friction or a conflict, everybody was involved in that. And the other piece of it was that, and this is just his particular perspective, but he said to me, what I see from you guys, meaning, Western sort of organizations, was if there's a problem, you got to solve it, and you got to solve it instantly. And he was like, that's not the way we solve problems.
mm.
And I didn't get to go too far into it. And again, let's be clear. There's a lot of variation and diversity within First Nations communities. So
Yeah.
the perspective of one isn't the perspective of another, and the perspective of an individual elder can vary from the perspective of another elder. Like, of course, right? But I did find it interesting because it kind of connects again to this idea of time. We have this need to like address the situation, record the situation, have an exchange of what happened, and have somebody sit in on it, and then the two people talk, or And his perception was you need to let sort of time and the rhythms of the community kind of bring that person back in.
Mm.
Do you have any experience with that concept of conflict resolution within the First Nations communities that
I
you've
think
worked
this
with?
is a fascinating topic, and we can go far beyond the indigenous organizations. But I think in general there's a genuine intention for keeping harmony, and it's not avoiding conflicts, but really try to keep the peace, and it makes sense because think first that an important aspect of resilience and thrive is to have that sense of belonging, that
Right,
your
right.
community, your people needs to be together. No, like alone you can go faster, but it's together that we can go further. And you don't want to have this kind of disharmony and tension that could block that. So in general, I see that people want to solve issues peacefully, taking the time and trying to find a way. And the the notion of the Longhouse is like we're all together. And
Yeah.
even if we have like an individual that is disturbing, it's part of this Longhouse. So together we need to find out the best way to deal with that.
See, to me, that is one of the key lessons to come out of this talk, right? Because I mean, I think back to times as a manager having to deal with conflict between two employees, between two people, and there's a procedure that I had to follow, right? And the procedure I remember at the time felt very unnatural, right? And you go into the office and you've got two people there, and each tells their story, and we talk about how is there, are there things that we're not seeing here from the other side, and here's what we need to do moving forward. And frankly, and maybe this speaks more to the limitations I had as a manager, but I think it has to do with the systemic approach that many organizations take to conflict resolution. It's very artificial, right?
So,
And, yeah, and just one other thing, there's no time, right? There's no opportunity for people to solve it themselves. There's no opportunity for people to just have a little bit of space, to come back to balance and feel safe and maybe work it out themselves. It's a very bureaucratic, structured way of dealing with conflict that I don't think works very well in my experience. Please go ahead with what you're going to say.
yeah, so here I want to make a distinction because one thing from my perspective is like what we can see as the indigenous ancestral values about managing conflict, and also what is an organizational culture in terms of dealing with these
Right.
tensions.
Right.
So yeah, like different organizations can have different mediation processes more faster than others. I would say that it's always important that people try to solve the problems by themselves first before having that mediation. But if that's not happening, that could have ripple effect and impact other employees or like the other colleagues. So it's difficult because I have seen also that in some organizations that could take too long. I mean, years. Yeah. And when you have
Good
like
point.
when you have that in place, like you can have like, well, why I'm going to do this if I see that my colleague here is not working or nothing happened, there are no consequences. So that impacts the whole work environment. So it's one of the things that how we can find like the middle way, like the best of those indigenous values about keeping harmony and solving things all together, and also having an effective process where, well, we need to clarify this to don't disturb the whole. Another interesting tension.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Yeah, you're right, because I have I have seen situations where these conflicts never get resolved, right? And these tensions never get resolved. However, I will say, if it ever blows up, so to speak, then there's this very formulaic, bureaucratic, controlled approach to the situation. I think there is something I'm resonating with about respecting space and time, and allowing a person to still feel part of the community as they're feeling temporarily outside of it, right? There's something there that I think is a useful area of inquiry for us, trying to learn from First Nations people around conflict. Because I'll go back to the fact that I don't think we do it very well. I mean, that's a pretty generalized blanket statement, but in my experience, we do not handle conflict resolution in organizations very well. So, and,
But
there
again,
are many.
it's cultural, Corey. You know, I come from
Yeah.
Chile. In Chile, because of this Latin way of being, Conflict is part of life, and we
Yeah.
experience conflict daily in the streets, and we have to deal with that. But it's different to have like a conflict that is damaging
Yeah.
your system, that approaching conflict in a more constructive way. What I can get from this? Why we're having this tension again and again? How we can have more open, sincere conversations to hopefully progress.
Yeah, I mean, agreed. Part of the problem with why we handle conflict so poorly, in my opinion, in Western organizations, is because we think of conflict as a bad thing, right? And sometimes it is. Sometimes it's an opening, right? Sometimes it's a little voice saying, "Hey, there's something not working here. What can we do about it? What's the opportunity here?" So anyways, a whole other area of inquiry.
Yeah,
We're gonna have to, I'm gonna have to keep you
another
on after the
episode.
podcast. Yeah, another maybe we turned it into another episode. That's right. Now you're originally from Chile. Are there any key commonalities that you've noticed between First Nations in Chile and here in Canada, and specifically around these ideas of thriving, resilience, maybe conflict resolution? Is there anything that stands out to you?
Well, for sure, there are some commonalities, and again, it's huge the spectrum of diversity of First Nations. Like in Chile, you have from up north in the desert, like the Aymara people, Atacameños, that they have a whole different cosmovision from the people in the south, the Mapuche, the Huilliche. But the main commonality, for sure, is the connection with the land, with nature. And I think um, the way I'm going to give you an example. When I was doing my thesis about the Mapuche female poetry, I interviewed a couple of poets, and this is people that was raised in the communities, in the forest, and because of work, studies, they need to start moving to the big cities, and that transition from the community, like close to the like the Longhouse, the La Ruca, or like the fire, the home, to the big city, the traffic, the noise, is tough. So what I notice in the poetry and the symbolism is that longingness to reconnect with nature, with the water, the river, the lakes. And I think that is something that is also very present in the First Nations here. When I see like the kids that they are planning to come to study to the south, to the big cities, to continue their studies, that transition is very difficult, moving from the community to the big cities. So the way of keeping alive the culture, the traditions, those traditional activities is key. That is what gives them the strength. I would say, especially if they are able to keep their language. It's well known that in Chile, for example, Mapudungun, that is the language of the Mapuche people, was prohibited, banished for a long time. Now it's coming back, and of course, the elders Mapuche, they keep it, and it was an oral tradition. Now you have like a whole alphabet, all that. But same thing with the other First Nations in Canada. If they can keep their own language, the mother language, that gives them a sense of identity and strength to, I know how I can express myself, describe things, connect with things.
It's so interesting because I have long believed that thriving is in part related to your level of connection with nature. Now, that's my particular perspective. I would add that my particular perspective is I think many of the problems that we see in inner cities could be alleviated by fresh perspective and energy that forests, trees, and wildlife give you. In fact, I remember when I was a kid, there was a program it had a kind of a funny name. It was called the Junior Ranger Program. But it, for the most part, I was part of it, and it brought mostly inner city kids out to the forest where they're,
Mm, mm,
holding axes and building portage routes and, living in nature and things like that. And it changed people. I mean, I wasn't an inner
absolutely.
city kid, but it changed me, right? And so, the fact that you're bringing this up, that certainly their language, but also that connection to nature and the activities and traditions that they do in nature. I think that's really interesting. I mean, even in my coaching, there have been many times I've talked to clients about, what they want when they feel at their best. And so many of the times, the reflections that they give back, they're in nature, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I was going to add that one of my learnings in these years was like people that really keep those traditions of going hunting and I mean it's not like, oh, I'm going hunting for the weekend. It's like it's 2 weeks going with the whole family, the kids, the grandmother, to set a camp in the trap lines in the forest and go back to those traditional activities, way of living. So yes, men go hunting and they bring back the game of the day, and then the women are cooking and but everyone is collaborating to set the camp, and people leaders says like, well, it's not just a break. Yes, it's a mental break from work, but we are reconnecting with these traditions that re-energize us. So when they come back to their community, it's not that they're coming more relaxed, but they come refreshed, and with all this, I would say like wellness from being in nature,
Yeah.
disconnected.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, listen, that's how I live, right? Like when I am able to be in the woods and spend some quality time there, it lends new insights. It gives me peace and energy. I
Mm.
feel probably I'm at my best in those situations, right? So I resonate with that. And, if we're getting back to the topic of thriving and resilience, that connection to nature and as you have emphasized, those activities, those traditions, whether it's within First Nations or outside of First Nations, that bring you to nature, that bring you together as a family.
Mm.
Those can be amazing sources of inner strength, identity, resilience, a sense of peace. And I would add, if you take the time while you're out there, new ideas, new perspectives that can feed new business ideas, that can feed, a solution to a problem that's been troubling you, in your life or
Yeah,
business,
you make me
So
think. Sorry, Corey,
go ahead.
about one of the leaders I work with, and um, many of these communities, now communities, but First Nations in the past, they were nomads, moving from one side to another. So um, today is different, of course, but some of them they really like driving, and being like in transition. And one of them says like, Rene, for me, this is like the thinking road. This is where I can, like disconnect or put my thoughts in a different space. I'm not interrupted. So I'm driving, and it's not like it's a long road, many
Yeah.
hours.
Yeah.
But it's that sense like you are surrounded by nature. You can even notice, well, birds are migrating, or there's more insect, or the weather. There's always a connection with that. And you have your thoughts coming up in a different way. I think it's great. It's great, and hopefully all people can see the value of being more out there.
Yeah, no, getting away from nature for a second, although in some ways not. I always turn to motorcycle therapy. So now I always go north and I'm surrounded by forest and,
Yeah.
and everything, but I am driving a vehicle that gives off fumes, and I'm on a road. But what I find is I am so present when I'm driving because I'm actually not using that time to think. I'm using that time just to be where I'm so aware of everything around me. I have to be for safety. And I'm just like noticing the hum of the engine, the feeling of acceleration, the turn of my body as I round a corner. Maybe I catch a smell of the forest and
Right.
things like that, right? And um, that's huge for me because that's presence, right? That's where I'm not projecting into the future with plans or thoughts or worries or anything like that. I'm just in the moment completely as each turn of the tire goes by down that road. So, yeah.
Well, I agree. Like beyond what we have discussed today of First Nations, like the capacity to be in the present moment, connecting with what is emerging there, is very healthy to just um, like feel that what is happening around me,
Mhm.
and keep keep things more clear.
Yeah. Yeah. It brings clarity. Yeah.
It brings clarity.
So, um, there's an issue that I'm curious about. So I'm not one of these people that denies science, right? I'm not one of these
Hmm.
people that says global warming isn't happening. But what I am is somebody that does not like limiting myself just by science. So I think the two problems I have with the scientific community at large is that one, they don't believe anything exists that isn't measured. So nothing is true unless it can be measured. And I think that takes away from lived experience, from wisdom. I have this expression that science catches up to grandmother's wisdom 50 years later, right? Um, and the other piece that I don't like is that they tend to think they have a monopoly on truth, right? Where as a recent example is, uh, for many years we've been told what the Big Bang was and how the universe operates, and there are certain inalienable, indisputable rules around that happened. And then a few months ago, 5, 6 months ago, a PhD student by accident found a structure in space, extremely large structure in space, that by those laws can't exist, right? So basically, they have to go back to
Mm,
the drawing
mm.
board and redo everything.
And
Um,
question, yeah.
yeah, and yet, and this is the piece that bothers me is up until that moment, that was truth. That was indisputable truth, right? So
Mm.
I think there's a danger there. Now, please understand, I'm not anti-science. I turn to science all the time in my coaching, especially neuroscience, and I think it has wonderful, wonderful things to teach us. The reason I'm going on this little soapbox, I should really get myself a soapbox and I should stand on it in front of the camera whenever I do something like this. But I guess what I'm saying is, if truth only exists in that which is measured, we're really cutting off a lot of our wisdom, right? We're cutting off because, behind the scenes in academia, there has to be a funding source, a company, a government. They have a particular agenda.
There's
They give
someone that
money.
has an interest in
Yeah,
that
and
this becomes the truth. Yeah.
right, right. And there's so much that we don't know, obviously, about, life, the universe, and everything.
Mm.
So to imagine that it's not real because it hasn't been measured, I think is really short-sighted. So here I'm talking about, wisdom. I'm talking about lived experience.
Yeah.
I'm talking about things that we know. There are, as an example, there are practices that we've done in coaching for many years that have been very effective that now science is explaining why they're effective. Like neuroscience will explain, well,
Yes,
that's why
yes.
this is, which I think is really important and really insightful. But we were already doing it for 20, 30 years, right? Because of lived experience, because of our understanding of how
And
people
basically,
operate
science
together.
is validating after, as you said, like 50
Alienating
years.
after. It's not always that science is on the forefront. A lot of time it's
Mm.
validating knowledge that we already had, lived knowledge, right? So the reason that this comes up to me right now is because First Nations communities um, do have very different perspectives on a lot of things, a lot of lived experience, a lot of traditions that go back centuries. Um, I will tell you, and this again, this is just one person's experience with a small group of people. But the elders that I had the opportunity to learn from radiated what I would call wisdom.
Mm.
Right? They radiated peace and wisdom. Yes, there was trauma,
Mm.
and all those things, but they radiated a wisdom that I found very compelling.
Mm.
Um, so, I wonder if anything about what I've just said sort of resonates with you in terms of your experience with those communities and their connection to, a different kind of knowing.
Well, there are many things that comes to mind from what you were describing. Um, but going back to First Nations and something that was very interesting for me, this was many years ago before the pandemic, that was kind of eye-opening for me. It's like I was working in a project, just supporting, coordinating, not involved in the content, about an assembly for gathering elders, mm? And bringing all those knowledge keepers, to share in terms of if it is possible or not to have like an integrated um, medicine system.
Mm, right, right.
And this was going to be a big gathering, and bringing elders from the territory, but also like Maori people from New Zealand, Ngangari from Australia, people from other provinces. Um, and the point was not to decide, was more to listen
Mm,
their experiences. What I find out is that there was disagreement between people and with some elders about if there should be like an integrated model or like two models in parallel.
mm, mm,
Naturally there was like mistrust of, well, at the end there are, and this is, we know, like pharmaceutical companies, that they get all this knowledge from how elders, First Nations get
yep,
medicine from nature,
yep.
and then becomes like a product. So and because of the evolution, some communities are, man, what we know is an ambulance. We don't want more like sweet lodges. Like
Mm-hmm,
it's uh, so there was a lot of different opinions. At the end, I don't know, but maybe this is karma. Things happen for some reason. Pandemic came, and
mm,
we have
mm,
to postpone first this big gathering, and finally didn't happen. It became
mm,
like a project. But for me, it was super interesting to see um, there's a wisdom there
mm,
in
mm,
that knowledge, or keeping that knowledge, and it's not, or elders or are more careful in when to share, who to share or not, and keeping that knowledge. um, so I'm always learning. I'm curious.
yeah,
I don't have
yeah,
a full
yeah.
understanding, but I
No,
see some things. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. No, that's we're trying to learn from each other and from the community that you're a guest in. Um, yeah, I mean, that brings up the topic of the rainforest being cut down and all of the herbs and potential medicines that we're losing in there. It brings up the whole pharmaceutical industry power and their active interest in decrediting those more traditional ways of healing, more natural ways of healing, because that's a way that doesn't create money for them, right? And sometimes that is because of their honest, genuine perspective, and sometimes that's because they don't want that knowledge out there competing with their
Yeah,
brand, right?
right.
So, okay, so I'm conscious of time here. Um, Let me end with this. Let's pretend for a second that you're standing on a podium. Okay, let's call it a sandbox. No, the eyes of North America are on you. You have an opportunity to share something about the First Nations communities you work with. So I ask you this final question: what could we all stand to learn from the First Nations communities you've worked with?
Mm. Uh, I think I think we all need a higher sense or high understanding of humanity and the importance of that sense of belonging. Mm.
Hmm.
I, I think it's very powerful when you see that communities connect and they it's like big families. Mm. So there's a sense of identity, of I'm coming from this community, and I know this is my people, and this is our river, the forest, and that I think is very powerful. It's very powerful, and in a world that is so polarized, that we have so many um, different perspectives, I really see the value of that kind of reunion. Mm? Uh, I think that the notion of family and being together is very powerful. Spending time, quality time together, like going in the nature, and pride of from where I come, because that give me clarity of where I want to go. And they don't. The notion of time change when you have that kind of clarity from where you come and where you want to go.
Very interesting. Really good timing. The mailman decided to come to the door, so my dog Mickey is having a very upset moment. Um, okay, well, listen. Thank you, Renee. That's very powerful. That last message, and I think it's been a fascinating discussion. So thank you so much for lending of your time and your energy and your expertise to be here today. I'm looking forward to connecting sometime in the near future. Maybe we can have you back in the future.
Hmm.
Have a wonderful rest of your day. Listeners, thank you so much for being here. If you have not already, please consider liking and subscribing. Enjoy the rest of your day and week. Corey, the coach, and Renee signing off.
Thank you very much, Corey. I will be back. Take care, man.